Okay, so the last components for the flush casement window are the sill extension and the glazing beading. So we'll start with the glazing beads. It's going to be a 17mm by 15mm square section bead. Then we're going to take a 30-degree bevel off of the long sides, the 17mm side, and just radius them two corners so there's no sharp edges. Here's the bead timber. I've planed this up from all the offcuts from the frames and casement material. So I'm going to stick the rebater in the spindle moulder, my go-to tool, because I can tilt my spindle. It's dead easy to get any angle you want with just a basic square rebater. So it's a good feature to have on your spindle moulder. Going to tilt that back to a 30-degree cut. So you need to move that centre out of the bed there. When I say 30-degree cut, what I actually meant was 15. Obviously. Okay, so we're machining the beading in this direction with that 15-degree bevel. Because we're about to take the ring insert out the bed here, we've got quite a big gap to span across the bed at the point at which the beading is being machined. So we're going to have to put a false bed or a sacrificial fence on the spindle moulder. So let's make ourselves a sacrificial fence. I'm going to run this along the as a false bed on the machine, and this as a false fence on the machine. So just got to joint those two bits together there with a couple of screws in the through the back of this piece. You want to keep these screws away from the centre because we're going to cut this portion of the sacrificial fence with the actual spindle moulder. I'm just going to, because that's the base of the fence, I'm just going to raise this piece up from it so it's not going to protrude from it in any way and affect the squareness of the machine. There we have it, one sacrificial fence. So we'll launch this on the machine and we can either clamp it to these beds or screw it through from the back of the fences here. What you want to do is just set these fences away so that they're past the parallel full width of the cutter, so no matter how deep you plunge this fence, you're not going to cut into your current fences that are on the machine. Just make sure you're out of the way of the screws where the cutter block is. Then we just fire the machine up and carefully plunge that cutter through the surface here to the depth that we want on the bead. Go slightly beyond where we want to cut and then just wind the fence back and just clear this bit that gets pushed forward from the cutting action. So the next step is to put the little radiuses on the beading. So I've got a nice little cutter here with a nice 3mm radius in the top of it. So as it sits in the machine, it will cut underneath the wood with that radius, which is perfect. So in order to use that, I've got to change the knives in the profile limiter. It's called a profile limiter because it's got a profile cutter and a limiter cutter within the block. So a cutter is the actual piece of tooling that does the cutting in the timber. So that's the furthest protruding part on the block, and that wants to be nice and sharp. And the limiter is actually a reverse profile of the cutter itself. It's just slightly smaller, so it's ground the same, but just about 1mm in of all the cutting parts of the actual knife that does the cutting. So we fit the cutter to one side of the block. So in a normal spindle moulder, as it sits in the block and face in the machine and faces you, the cutter goes in the left of the block. So it rotates in a anti-clockwise direction and does the cutting in that manner. You can mount them backwards if your machine will spin in the opposite direction. So we just put the two cutters in and slide the wedge in behind them in the block, and then we do up the two Allen head grub screws with a wrench. And it's just a nip, so not too tight, just enough to make sure that they're seated. And it's the same on the other side, making sure that you put the cutter in the same orientation as the other pair. I always undo these cutters just a couple of turns because you want enough clearance for that wedge to drop away, and then remove it from the block. And you just have to give it a tap. Once the block's been used, that wedge really does wedge them cutters into place, and you can't sort of get them free. So I just give it a tap with the Allen wrench in the actual socket. Gentle tap, and it releases the pressure on the wedge. Okay, so same principle again. We've got a big gap on the bed. And we've got to have the fences fairly wide apart to suit this cutter block. So we'll put the false fence on there to really support that beading and make a nice consistent cut with no diving into the beds. So I think we've probably even reused the one we've just made. We'll set the height off of the bed here, and then we'll wind it back until we've got the cut that we want. Okay, so I've just run all them beadings through in this plane. The reason I've orientated it like that to put it through the spindle is it's the most accurate way of referencing that cut. So if I was to cut this round first on this corner here, it would affect the cut for this round because it's actually referencing off this square edge on the top here because it's on a bevel. So the most accurate way to get both them cuts consistent is to work off them flat faces. So not machining this edge for a start allows us to get an accurate first cut on there, and then this cut here, which we'll do next, isn't affected at all by the fact we've done that cut, so it makes sense to do this one first. You can of course get a beading cutter that will do all this in one go, and also put a round on this side or a round and a rebate depending on what you want and what style of beading you like, but that's totally up to you to machine your style of beading. It's just worth mentioning that you can orientate the timber again like we have done all the way along, so that if there's a minor imperfection in the beading somewhere, you could lose that where it's hidden against the glass or the rebate, and have the best face facing outwards. Okay, so we'll reset up for this next cut. We'll cut it in this orientation, and because we've not got that bevel, we just need to wind the fences out slightly so we take a bit less material off. And that's the beading finished on the spindle moulder. Against the rounded edge of the rails and stiles, the beading finish will look something like that. Like I say, really it's down to personal preference as to what style of beading you like, but I'd definitely keep all edges on the beading with a nice round on it, so you've got that protection against the finish on the wood from peeling at them sharp corners. And finally we are left with the sub-sill. So we've got a 10mm groove in the piece of sill that we've used, and that is 8mm deep. So we'll just go just shy of 8mm, so we want to be about 7.5mm, 7 to 7.5mm. We will square that line down. So we're taking a rebate out of there to produce a tight fit in that groove in the window, so we can check that on the physical window. And then we're doing a 9-degree bevel from where that point casts through square on here, so where that edge finishes on this, where it seats up to the window. From that point there we want a 9-degree bevel. I'm just going to roughly jot that on because I've not got my angle gauge with me. So we'll take that bevel off of here. We want a anti-capillary groove in the bottom of the sill, and then we're going to take a sort of like a 1/4 inch radius, something a bit bigger than 3mm, off of this top edge, because that's the surface there that is most prone to any damage from water, and then just a nice little 3mm radius off this bottom corner to protect it from sharp edge weathering. So it's much of the same principle as the beading. We've got a bigger section timber, so we're not going to need that sacrificial fence to guide the timber through between the beds. So we can take that off. You can of course use something like this every time you use the machine, but quite honest, it's not necessary, and it'll just take a bit of time. Keep hold of them because they're quite handy to reuse. So I'm going to jump straight in with the rebater, but I'm going to do the bevel first because it's nice to work with a square piece of timber to feed it through the machine to make that bevel, rather than rebating that back in. You can use any form of cutter that will produce a 9mm bevel across the full width of the sill that you require. Again, if you're not confident in your machining yet, or you're new to it, you can do this on a test piece as well. So get a small short test piece, the same dimensions, and work with that. So while we've got the rebater in, we'd be silly not to do this cut next. So the setting for that, the height of that cutter is the width of this groove here. So we're looking for a fairly tight fit, but not that you'd have to hammer it home along the whole length of the sill. So it's worth checking these with an actual groove cut rather than just using a measurement. That's quite tight, but I'm going to leave it. I'm sure that can be adjusted if it needs to be, if it's painted before this is glued in place. We're just going to deepen that cut back a bit so that we've got a bit less of a gap at the back here. There we go, that's perfect. You don't want it too tight because we're going to get where we apply glue to these edges on that joint. It's got to go somewhere, so it can just sit in that little gap in the back of the sill extension there. Okay, so we'll run this this top round over in now. Same principle as the beading. We're going to cut that one first there because we're running on this edge here, and it's more accurate to run it off that edge than run it off a already machined surface. I'm going to use a 9mm radius cutter to take this cut out, but it's a perfect 9mm radius cutter for a 90 degree, so the cutter's just going to have to sit slightly back from being a nice smooth round, because that is 9 degrees past 90 degree. If you try to get a perfect cut to both surfaces, you're going to end up with a little nick in the face. Now, because the angle on the timber here is 97 degrees and the cutter is designed for a 90 degree piece of timber, I'm just going to tilt the cutter back by 4.5 degrees so it evens that difference out. You might well have a sill cutter block that will put a nice radius on there all in one pass, but I've not, and I've not had a cutter made to suit that angle there. And finally, the capillary groove or anti-capillary groove in the bottom of the sill. I'll put the 3mm radius on here using my little palm router with the 3mm cutter in, because I'm going to do the ends anyway. I'll just run it through at the same time. This is a 8mm diameter drip groove. On a sill like this, I just like to wind it up 2mm to make that drip groove a little bit wider. Like I say, run the router around the ends, along that joint there, or the front edge there. Give it a sand and it's ready for paint. I think we're about overdue a new router bit. She's done some work. We just want to take a fairly heavy sharp edge off of that drip groove. I use a backing block for this because it's deadly for getting splinters, that is. Bloody deadly. Okay, so there we have it. That's a fairly comprehensive how-to instructional series of videos on a flush casement window, and that's for a technique that's not using a tensioner. So if you've not got a tensioner in your workshop, which I suspect most home workshops don't, this is a pretty good guide for you on how to make this style of window. Most of the cuts that I've done on the spindle moulder can be done with a router table, so really there's not an awful lot stopping you making something like this if you've got a fairly decent setup. Hope you've enjoyed the video. Please give it a like, and all the other ones in the series if they've been helpful to you. And pop in the comments, thanks Mark for he's actually commissioned this video and allowed me to post it on the channel, so if we can show some appreciation towards him, that would be great. And I personally wish him the best of luck with his window project and his whole house that he's building. He's building a farmhouse from scratch pretty much, so yeah, it's a really interesting project, and I wish him well with it. Like I said before, next time I get a flush casement window, I'll pick up this series and go through the glue up process and glazing, fitting and hanging of the casements, and perhaps a finishing as well, but there might be a separate series on paint finishes on windows coming up shortly anyway.